It started innocently enough. I mean, you never expect your life to turn into a horror story, do you? I didn't. I thought I was just another person, going through the motions, doing the daily grind. But then, things took a turn. A terrifying, skin-crawling turn that I still can't fully wrap my head around. It was a typical night, or at least it seemed that way. The kind where the silence is almost too loud, and every little creak makes your heart jump. I had just moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood in Dallas. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were polite but distant, everything I wanted. But something about the place felt off. Like the air was just a little too thick, and the shadows seemed to linger a little too long in the corners. At first, I brushed it off. I mean, new places always take time to feel like home, right? But then, strange things started happening. The kind of things you read about in horror stories but never expect to happen to you. It started small, barely noticeable, like misplaced keys or lights flickering. Typical old house quirks, I told myself. But then one night I woke up to a sound I couldn't ignore. It was around 3 a.m., that creepy time when the world is dead quiet and every little sound seems amplified. There was a soft, almost rhythmic tapping coming from my front door. I froze. You know that feeling when your heart just stops and your mind goes blank? That's exactly what happened. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe for a moment. The tapping continued, deliberate, like someone or something was waiting. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. There was a certain weight to the sound, like it was intentional. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slowly got out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the cold floor. The apartment was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, casting eerie shadows through the blinds. As I crept closer to the door, the tapping stopped. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure whoever was on the other side could hear it. I reached for the peephole, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the empty hallway bathed in the sickly yellow light of the hallway bulb. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring, waiting for something, anything to explain what the hell just happened. But there was nothing. Just the silence, pressing in on me, suffocating me. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. But as I turned to go back to bed, there it was again. The tapping, this time louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. And that's when the real horror began. The night had grown thick with an oppressive silence, one that clung to the very walls of my apartment, suffocating the air with an indescribable dread. I sat trembling, my hand still resting upon the door handle as though it held me tethered to the only reality I knew. Yet that reality was crumbling before me. The tapping, it had stopped. But the absence of sound now felt far more menacing than the sound itself. I stood there, paralyzed, in that dark hallway where shadows seemed to breathe, to watch. Had I gone mad? I asked myself this over and over, pacing the small confines of my living room, like a caged animal seeking escape. The thought was intoxicating, vile even, but it whispered to me, gnawed at the edges of my mind. Was it not madness that causes one to see horrors where none exist? To hear that which is not there? My pulse raced as I tried to shake the notion from my thoughts, but the feeling remained. Something was there, watching, waiting. I turned to the window, its blinds half drawn, offering a view of the lonely street outside. There, beneath the weak light of the street lamp, shadows danced unnaturally, distorting into grotesque shapes that flickered and twisted with each passing breeze. But amidst those shadows I could sense something more. Eyes, hidden within the folds of darkness, watching me with a quiet intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I dared not approach the window for fear of what might be lurking just beyond it. To look out was to confront the unknown, and the unknown is where terror thrives. Suddenly, the sensation of being observed grew intolerable, pressing down upon my chest like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. My skin crawled with the unnerving certainty that I was not alone. No, something malignant, something malevolent, had settled into the very fabric of my existence, wrapping itself around me like a noose, tightening with each breath I took. I began to check every door, every window, seeking comfort in the lock's reassuring click, but found none. My sanctuary had become a prison of fear, each corner of the room harboring a secret I could not comprehend. The very walls seemed to close in, breathing with an unseen life. There was nowhere safe, no place where I could hide from this. This presence that loomed over me like a specter. It was then, amidst the clutches of my terror, that I heard it. Faint at first, like a distant whisper carried on the wind, but soon growing louder, more insistent. The sound, a soft scratching, coming from the window. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, almost against my will, I moved toward the sound, my body numb with fear, my mind screaming at me to stop. But something pulled me forward, some dark curiosity, or perhaps a fatalistic acceptance of the inevitable. With trembling hands I reached for the blinds. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as though whatever lay beyond the glass was desperate to be let in. I hesitated, my heart pounding so violently I feared it might burst. But I had to know. I had to see. I pulled the blinds open. There was nothing. Only the street, deserted and silent, bathed in that sickly yellow glow. No figure. No hand pressing against the glass. No grotesque face peering in. But just as I began to breathe again, I noticed it. A small smear on the window, right where the sound had come from. A mark, as though fingers had dragged across the glass. And I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever had been out there was still waiting. There are nights when silence is more terrifying than noise. Nights where the air grows so still, so suffocating, that it feels as though the world itself has forgotten to breathe. This was one of those nights. In the hours that crawled between midnight and dawn, my apartment had transformed from a refuge into a tomb. Its walls cold, unyielding, and filled with an unspeakable presence that I could neither see nor escape. I had not slept since the night of the tapping. My thoughts had become tangled in a web of fear, each strand pulling tighter, strangling reason. How could I explain what I knew, what I had felt? To speak of it aloud would only confirm my descent into madness. And yet there it was, lurking in the back of my mind, the mark on the window. A fleeting but undeniable proof that something or someone had been there, clawing at the glass like a phantom desperate to enter. I could not let go of that image. It haunted my every waking moment. Even now, as I sat in the darkened corner of my living room, my eyes fixated on that very window, I could feel the pulse of dread rising again in my chest. I had sealed it shut, drawn the blinds tight, but it didn't matter. No matter what I did, no matter how I tried to secure myself, the terror remained. For it wasn't the window itself that frightened me, it was what lay beyond it. The unseen, the unknown. The hours dragged on, each one a torment unto itself, as I waited for something to happen. I didn't know what it was I feared, only that it was inevitable. My mind, in its endless cycle of dread, began to play tricks on me. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps approaching. And then, just when the tension had become unbearable, it started. A whisper. At first, I thought it was merely the wind outside, moaning softly through the gaps in the windowsill. But no, this was no natural sound. It was human, faint, but unmistakable. A voice, soft and sinister, seeping into the room like a poison gas. My heart froze in my chest as I strained to hear, praying I was mistaken. But the voice persisted, a low murmur just at the edge of comprehension, as though someone were standing in the corner, speaking directly to me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was filled with malice, like an ancient curse being whispered into the ear of a dying man. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. It was in the walls, in the floor, in my very bones. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, as though the room itself had become possessed by the voice. And then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the whisper itself. It was as if the world had drawn its last breath, leaving me in a void where sound, light, and life could no longer reach. I was alone, but I was not alone. I could feel it, something there in the room with me, though I could not see it. The presence, the same malevolent force that had been lurking since that first knock on my door, had drawn nearer. Closer. I don't know what possessed me, what dark urge guided my hand, but I found myself rising from my chair, my legs moving of their own accord. Slowly, I made my way toward the window, that cursed window, with its now closed blinds. I had to look. I had to know if whatever was out there had returned. But as I stood before it, my hand trembling on the cord, I hesitated. A voice, my own this time, screamed in the back of my mind. Don't. But it was too late. With one sharp tug, the blinds flew up, revealing the street beyond. And there, standing just outside the window, staring directly at me, was a figure, a silhouette cloaked in darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I felt its eyes, boring into me, seeing everything, knowing everything. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, as the figure raised a hand and slowly, deliberately placed it against the glass, right where the mark had been. And then, it smiled. I wish I could tell you that I screamed, that some primal instinct took hold of me, urging me to flee, to escape the clutches of that wretched thing beyond the window. But no scream came. No cry of terror could break the suffocating grip that had seized my throat, my very soul. I stood there, frozen, as if the air itself had turned to stone around me, my limbs heavy with the weight of an unspeakable dread. The figure outside did not move. It remained fixed, a grotesque silhouette against the faint glow of the street lamp, its hand pressed against the glass in mockery of human warmth. And though its face was shrouded in shadow, I could feel its eyes, black and empty as the void, piercing through me, as though it saw not only my body, but the fragile threads of my mind unraveling before its gaze. It smiled again. That smile, oh God, was not meant for this world. It was twisted, unnatural, a ghastly imitation of life, as if some malevolent force had plucked it from the darkest corners of the human soul and stitched it onto the face of a monster. My knees buckled beneath me, but I did not fall. I was held in place by an invisible hand, a force I could neither see nor resist. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Minutes, hours, days, it could have been any of these. I stood there, locked in that macabre communion with the thing at my window, my mind spinning into a whirlpool of terror and confusion. I tried to think, to piece together what was happening, but my thoughts slipped away like sand through my fingers. The world had become a nightmare, and I was its prisoner. It was then that I heard it again, the whisper. That same haunting murmur that had first crept into my room, now louder, clearer, as if it were coming from within me, as though my very thoughts had turned against me. But no, it was not just in my head. The voice was real, tangible, and with it came the realization that I was not alone in the room. I turned, my body moving slowly, painfully, as though submerged in a thick, invisible fog. And there, standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow, was another figure. Smaller than the one outside, yet equally as sinister. Its outline was indistinct, a shifting, flickering mass, as though it were caught between this world and some hellish other. "Do you see now?" the voice hissed, though the figure's mouth did not move. "Do you understand?" I wanted to scream, to beg for answers, but my throat remained dry, parched with fear. The figure took a step toward me, and the room seemed to close in around us, the walls bending, warping like the fevered dreams of a madman. I stumbled back, crashing into the window, the cold glass pressing against my spine like the grip of death itself. The figure outside pressed closer, its hand still on the glass, as though it could pass through at any moment. "Do you understand?" the voice repeated, louder now, angrier. "You cannot escape." The truth of those words sank into me like a dagger. I was trapped, not just in this room, not just in this moment, but in some cosmic nightmare, a labyrinth of horror that had no end. And the figures, the shadows, they were its architects. They had come for me, and there was no escaping their reach. The walls pulsed, closing in tighter, the air growing thick with the scent of decay. My vision blurred, the edges of the room dissolving into darkness. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears like the final toll of a bell. And then, just as the shadows reached for me, just as I felt the cold touch of their fingers on my skin, everything went silent. Utter, complete silence. The figures were gone. The walls, the window, the room, it was all as it had been before. I stood there, trembling, drenched in sweat, my mind reeling from the sudden shift. But something was wrong. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. I could no longer hear my heartbeat. Panic surged through me as I pressed my hand to my chest, searching for the familiar rhythm of life. But there was nothing. No pulse, no breath, only silence. I stumbled to the mirror, desperate to see, to understand. But what stared back at me was not my reflection. It was the shadow. The very thing I had feared, the darkness that had plagued my nights, was now staring back at me from the glass. Its eyes, my eyes, its form, my form. I had become it. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came, only the faint, distant echo of a whisper that now belonged to me. And in that moment, I understood. There was no escape. I don't know how to start this, or even if I should. Talking about it feels like giving it power, like somehow, if I say the words out loud, it'll come back. But I have to get it out. Maybe that's the only way I'll ever be able to sleep again. Maybe. It all started a couple of months ago when I moved into this new place. A tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. It wasn't much, but it was cheap, and for someone like me, scraping by paycheck to paycheck, that was enough. The landlord didn't care about credit scores or references. As long as you had the cash, the place was yours. The building itself was old, almost forgotten, tucked away behind an overpass, with cracked windows and peeling paint. It had that unsettling vibe, you know? Like the walls had seen too much. I should have taken that as a sign, but when you're desperate, you learn to ignore the warnings. You have to. The first few nights were uneventful, or at least I convinced myself they were. Sure, the place creaked and groaned like it was alive, but old buildings do that, right? The pipes rattled, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but nothing really stood out. Until the third night. I woke up, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. The room was pitch black, and the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, filled the air. Then I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A shuffle. At first, I thought it was outside, maybe just some stray animal, but then it came again. Closer. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own heartbeat. There it was. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I forced myself to get up, tiptoeing towards the front door, the cheap wooden floorboards creaking under my feet. Every instinct screamed at me to lock the door, to turn on every light in the apartment, but something stopped me. I stood there, in the dark, hand hovering over the light switch, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped. I could feel them now, though, like someone or something was standing right on the other side of the door. The air felt thick, almost oily, clinging to my skin. I don't know why I did it, but I pressed my ear against the door. And then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deep, raspy breaths like someone was struggling to pull in air. I felt this cold wave of dread wash over me, like ice water in my veins. Whoever or whatever was out there didn't knock. They didn't try to open the door. They just stood there, breathing. I don't remember how long I stood there, too terrified to move, too terrified to do anything at all. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. All I know is, when I finally gathered the courage to turn the light on and look through the peephole, no one was there. Nothing. Just the empty, dimly lit hallway. I tried to convince myself it was a nightmare. Maybe I'd never really woken up at all. But the next morning when I opened the door, there were muddy footprints. Not mine. And they led away from my door, disappearing into the cracked, shadowy hall. That's when the real fear started. The kind of fear that buries itself deep inside you, gnawing at your sanity. I wish I could say that was the worst of it, but it wasn't. That was just the beginning. And whatever it wasn't done with me yet. There are certain moments in life when the fabric of reality seems to unravel before your very eyes. And in those fleeting instances, you are left naked, exposed to a terror far greater than anything tangible. It was in the dim glow of that morning, as I stared at the muddy imprints outside my door, that I first tasted the true bitterness of that dread. The footprints mocked me, silent echoes of something I could not see but could sense lurking just beyond the fragile veil of the world I thought I knew. I tried to carry on. Truly, I did. I convinced myself it was a trick of the mind, the result of sleepless nights and restless dreams. But no amount of rational thought could shake the suffocating weight that now settled in my chest. It clung to me like a shadow, heavy and relentless, making even the air in my apartment feel thick, tainted. I couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something had found me, something that should never have been disturbed. That night, I was afraid to sleep. The minutes dragged on like hours, and every creak of the walls, every faint whistle of wind through the cracks seemed more sinister, more alive than before. I lay there, eyes wide open in the oppressive darkness, and that's when it started. Faint at first, barely perceptible, a sound that seemed to crawl out from the depths of the apartment itself. A whisper. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. No, it was something far worse. It was as if the walls themselves had learned to breathe, their very fabric woven with soft, indistinct murmurs. Words, if one could call them that, seeped through the cracks, too quiet to decipher, yet laden with malice. The whispers curled around my mind, tightening their grip, each syllable imbued with a dread that defied reason. I shut my eyes, praying for silence, for the quiet oblivion of sleep. But sleep, cruel and elusive, would not come. I could feel it then. Not just hear it, but feel it. The presence. It was no longer confined to the hallway. It was inside, with me, breathing the same foul air, filling the room with an oppressive weight that pressed down on my chest. I tried to sit up, to move, but my limbs felt paralyzed by fear. And in that moment, my thoughts betrayed me, spiraling into an abyss of madness. What if it was waiting? What if it had been waiting all along? What if every sleepless night, every haunted breath, was not mere coincidence, but part of its slow, deliberate approach? My mind raced, conjuring images too horrific to bear. I thought of the shadows beneath the viaduct, of creatures that lurked in the dark places of the earth, forgotten by time, but not by fear. Had something followed me here? Was I marked, cursed to carry this torment like a stain upon my soul? I don't know how long I remained in that tortured state, half awake, half mad with terror. But at some point, exhaustion must have claimed me, for when I opened my eyes again, the faint light of dawn was seeping through the grimy window. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. It was the kind of silence that settles over a graveyard, heavy with the knowledge of things best left undisturbed. I forced myself out of bed, legs trembling beneath me, and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars passed under the overpass, pedestrians walked to and fro, oblivious to the horrors that lurked just out of sight. But I knew there was something waiting, watching from the shadows beneath the surface. And then I saw it. Barely noticeable at first, a faint smudge on the glass, as if someone had pressed their hand against it from the outside. But I lived on the 3rd floor. There was no ledge, no balcony. It was impossible. I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The handprint seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, its presence an undeniable message. Whatever it was, it wanted in. And I realized with a cold certainty that chilled me to the bone. There would be no escape from this. Whatever had found me beneath the viaduct was here now. It had come to finish what it started. The whispers would return, and next time, I wouldn't wake up. There are moments in a man's life when the walls of sanity begin to close in, narrowing his world until all that remains is the fragile shell of reason, trembling and brittle beneath the weight of something unspeakable. In those moments, madness does not descend like a thunderclap. It creeps in, like a shadow at the edge of your vision, always present, always waiting. That shadow had long since found its home in the corners of my apartment. And now, as the days stretched into a feverish blur, I began to feel its presence more intimately, as though it were no longer content to haunt the fringes of my world, but sought instead to burrow itself beneath my skin, to become part of me. I scarcely left my apartment after that second night. There was no safety beyond its walls, but within them, the very air seemed thick with dread. Time itself felt warped. Hours bled into one another like ink on wet paper, indistinguishable, each breath blending into the next. Sleep no longer brought the relief I so desperately craved. When it came at all, it was fragmented, interrupted by the soft murmur of voices I could never quite make out, like a distant chorus just beyond hearing, chanting my undoing. I knew they were not merely in my mind. It was on the third night, or perhaps the fourth, that I first felt the touch. I had been lying in the half-darkness, my eyes wide, staring at the cracked ceiling above, counting the tiny fissures that spidered out across the plaster like veins. My thoughts had begun to blur, drifting in and out of lucidity when I felt it. Cold, sharp, unmistakable. Something brushed against my arm. It was not the soft, gentle sensation of fabric or a breeze. No, it was deliberate. A finger, icy and thin, running along my skin, tracing the contours of my arm with an almost curious intent. My body seized with terror, but I couldn't move. My limbs were frozen, my voice choked back by a paralyzing fear. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat a violent reminder that I was still alive, though how much longer I did not know. In the oppressive silence that followed, the whispers began again. This time, they were closer, no longer muffled behind walls, but rising from within the very room. Faint, but distinct, they circled around me. Voices like the wind through the branches of a dead tree, their words crawling under my skin like worms. I couldn't understand them, but I didn't need to. The intent was clear. It was malice, pure and unrelenting, a dark hunger that sought to unravel me thread by thread. I forced myself to sit up, my body moving with the slow resistance of one trapped in a nightmare. The room was bathed in a sickly half-light, the shadows deeper than they had any right to be. And in the corner, near the doorway, something shifted. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eyes, but no. The movement was real. A shadow darker than the night itself, curling like smoke, coiling tighter, as though it were watching, waiting for something. I wanted to scream, to tear my own skin off just to be free of the crawling sensation beneath it. Instead, I found myself rooted to the spot, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs. The thing in the corner didn't move, didn't advance, but I felt its gaze, cold and relentless, boring into me as if it could see through every defense I had left. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it was playing with me. Whatever it was patient. It wanted to break me. And it was working. The hours dragged on, every tick of the clock another dagger in my skull. I tried to distract myself, to busy my mind with anything else. Reading, pacing, even talking aloud to hear the sound of my own voice, in hopes it would drown out the whispers. But nothing worked. The air in the room felt thick, almost tangible, pressing down on me with a weight that left me gasping for breath. The walls, once solid, now seemed to pulse, alive with the dark, rhythmic thrum of whatever force had invaded my life. I could no longer bear the silence. Grabbing my coat, I stumbled out of the apartment, into the cold night air. The city was still, eerily quiet beneath the overpass, but I welcomed the bitter chill. I needed to escape, but as I crossed the threshold into the street, I felt it. A pull, like a string tied around my heart, tugging me back towards the apartment. No matter how far I went, I would never truly leave. Something was following me, watching me, and there was no escaping it. I knew with the dawning horror that consumed my every waking thought that the darkness I had felt beneath the viaduct was no longer just a memory. It had come for me, and it would not stop until it claimed me. There was no safety. There was no escape. Only the hollow beneath the skin, where fear lives eternal. There is a peculiar sound the mind makes when it begins to crack. A faint, distant ringing, like the last toll of a bell, reverberating endlessly through the caverns of one's soul. I hear it now, that sound, growing louder with each passing hour, a maddening rhythm that marks the disintegration of my sanity. It echoes in my skull, relentless, as if the walls of my mind are crumbling, stone by stone, beneath the weight of something vast and unspeakable. I sit alone in the dark, my back pressed against the cold concrete of my apartment floor, knees drawn to my chest like a child seeking comfort in the arms of an absent mother. But there is no comfort here. No safety to be found in the hollowed-out space where once my reason resided. The air is heavy, oppressive, thick with the stench of decay, though whether it is the scent of the world around me or the rot festering within, I cannot say. I have not slept in days. Sleep, when it comes, is a mercy I no longer deserve. For when my eyes close, even for a fleeting moment, I am plunged into a world where shadows crawl and whispers become screams. And in those nightmares, I see them. The others. The ones who disappeared beneath the viaduct, whose faces have long since faded from memory, but whose terror lingers like an indelible stain on my soul. I can see them now in the corners of my vision, their hollow eyes staring, accusing, their mouths twisted in silent screams. They haunt me, these phantoms, not with violence, but with their terrible, unrelenting presence. I know they blame me for escaping, for surviving when they could not. But what they do not understand is that I have not escaped. I have merely delayed the inevitable. The darkness from the viaduct is here, in this very room, seeping into every crack and crevice, curling around my limbs like smoke. It is inside me, festering in the deepest recesses of my mind, gnawing away at my thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self. It speaks to me now, not in whispers, but in a low, guttural voice, a voice that seems to rise from the pit of my own being. You cannot hide. The words slither through the air, wrapping themselves around my throat, tightening until I can scarcely breathe. I know I should scream, but my voice has long since abandoned me. What good would it do? There is no one left to hear. The city outside is silent, the world beyond these walls as desolate and empty as my soul. Even the light of the street lamps has been swallowed by the encroaching night. Come back. The voice calls to me, and I feel its pull, a magnetic force drawing me back toward the place I swore I would never return to. The viaduct. That cursed, forsaken place where it all began. I know, deep in the marrow of my bones, that I cannot resist. It has claimed me already, bound me to its darkness like a prisoner to a chain. And so, with leaden limbs and a heart pounding with dread, I rise from the floor. The night is cold, but I do not feel it. My mind is numb, my body moving as though in a trance, driven by a force beyond my control. I walk through the empty streets of Austin, the distant hum of the city, a dull roar in my ears. The shadows grow longer, deeper, until they stretch across the pavement like gaping maws, hungry and waiting. And then I see it, the viaduct. Its hulking form looms before me, a beast of stone and steel, crouched beneath the blackened sky. The tunnel yawns wide, its mouth a void of impenetrable darkness. I stop at the edge, my breath shallow, my heart thudding in my chest. Every instinct screams at me to turn back, to flee, but I cannot. The pull is too strong, the voice too insistent. Come, come and see. With trembling hands, I step forward, crossing the threshold into the tunnel. The air here is colder, sharper, biting at my skin like the teeth of some unseen predator. The walls close in around me, the sound of my footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. and then from the depths of the darkness I hear it. A scraping, a low guttural rasp like claws dragging across stone. My pulse quickens, my throat tightens, and for the first time in what feels like an eternity, I feel true, primal fear. I turn to run, but my legs betray me, frozen in place. The darkness presses in closer, wrapping itself around me like a shroud, and I know this is the end. The thing that haunts this tunnel, the creature that has claimed so many lives, is here. I can feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking, as it slithers closer, its presence a weight I can no longer bear. I try to scream, but the sound dies in my throat, swallowed by the suffocating dark. And then I see it. A face. No, not a face, but a mass of shadows and shifting forms. A thing that defies all reason, all understanding. Its eyes are empty, hollow voids, and yet they see me. They see everything. The terror that courses through me in that moment is unlike anything I have ever known. It is pure, unfiltered, and it consumes me whole. In that instant, I understand the truth. There is no escape. There never was. The darkness has claimed me, as it has claimed so many before, and now I am part of it. The last thing I hear, before the void swallows me whole, is the sound of my own heartbeat, slowing, fading, until all that remains is silence. It was a chilly autumn night, the kind that wraps itself around you like a suffocating blanket, making you acutely aware of every creak and groan of your home. I had just settled down with a book, the dim light casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. But no amount of distraction could ease the gnawing sense of unease crawling up my spine. It was there, lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering that something was off. I lived alone in a quaint little house, nestled at the end of a quiet street in a town that seemed to be perpetually shrouded in fog. It had its charm, the white picket fence, the overgrown garden, the way the wind rustled the leaves in a gentle, almost musical way. But tonight, the charm felt more like a facade, a mask hiding something far more sinister. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, echoing through the silence like a drumbeat of impending doom. I glanced at my phone. Just past midnight. Why was I still awake? Maybe it was the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just the imagination of a mind that had indulged a bit too much in horror novels. But the air felt thick, electric, as if the very walls were charged with a malevolent energy. A soft sound broke the stillness, a whisper, barely audible. It seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. I froze, my heart pounding like a war drum. It's just the wind, I told myself, though I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I strained my ears, trying to decipher the murmur, but it was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Against my better judgment, I pushed myself up from the couch and moved cautiously toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, the wooden floorboards creaking ominously beneath my weight. I glanced at the darkened rooms, their doorways gaping like hungry mouths ready to swallow me whole. I felt like a moth drawn to the flame, knowing all too well that I should turn back, yet compelled to venture deeper into the shadows. As I passed the bathroom, the light flickered briefly, plunging me into darkness. My breath hitched in my throat. I hesitated, then stepped into the bathroom, flicking the switch. The bulb hummed to life, casting a sterile glow that did little to alleviate the growing sense of dread. I looked into the mirror, my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide, mouth slightly agape. But I wasn't alone. In the corner of the mirror's reflection, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting just beyond the doorway. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage like a frantic prisoner seeking escape. "Get a grip," I muttered under my breath, attempting to quell the rising panic. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, as if the floor had transformed into quicksand, threatening to pull me under. I summoned every ounce of courage and stepped out of the bathroom, the hallway stretching before me, cloaked in darkness. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on my chest as I moved toward the living room, where I felt the safety of the familiar. But just as I reached the doorway, I heard it again. A soft, melodic whisper, more distinct this time, wrapping around me like a cold wind. "Help me." The words slithered into my ears, chilling me to the bone. Who was it? What did they want? Panic surged through my veins, and I stumbled back, retreating into the safety of the bathroom. I slammed the door shut, heart racing, and pressed my back against it, praying it would hold whatever malevolence lay beyond. But then I heard it, a low, menacing chuckle from the other side of the door. It was a sound I could never unhear, a haunting melody that resonated deep within my soul. The whispering had transformed, morphing into something darker, something that promised terror. I was no longer alone in my house. I was being hunted. In the grip of the suffocating silence that enveloped me, I pressed my back against the cold, unyielding door, my breath shallow and erratic. The soft chuckle reverberated through the air, a sound so unnerving it seemed to seep into the very fibers of my being, twisting them with insidious intent. It was a laughter devoid of mirth, resonating like a death knell, echoing the shadows of my deepest fears. Time lost its meaning as I stood there, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The darkness of the bathroom felt stifling, the flickering light bulb above casting grotesque shadows that danced upon the walls like sinister phantoms. I closed my eyes, attempting to retreat into the sanctuary of my mind, but it was a futile endeavor. The darkness had become my confessor, laying bare my terrors with each passing moment. What was lurking just beyond the door? What malevolent entity had invaded my sanctuary, shattering the fragile peace I once took for granted? My mind spiraled into a tempest of horror, conjuring images of creatures birthed from the depths of my imagination. Twisted forms with hollow eyes and jagged teeth, ready to devour my sanity. And yet, as terrifying as these phantoms were, they paled in comparison to the cold realization that the real horror lay in the unknown. "Help me." The whisper echoed again, now a plaintive wail that pierced the silence, causing my heart to lurch violently in response. Was it a plea for aid or a summons for doom? Each syllable curled around my mind like smoke, clouding my judgment, igniting a fierce battle between reason and instinct. Compelled by an inexplicable urge, I pressed my ear against the door, straining to decipher the sounds beyond. My pulse quickened as I heard soft, shuffling footsteps, deliberate, calculated, and chillingly close. The weight of dread settled heavily upon me, a thick fog that constricted my chest, rendering me breathless. The weight of dread settled heavily upon me, a thick fog that constricted my chest, rendering me breathless. My thoughts raced, spiraling into the abyss of paranoia. Was I simply a victim of my own imagination, or had I unwittingly drawn the attention of something truly evil? Every creak of the floorboards beyond sent shards of terror coursing through my veins. I could almost visualize the shape of my tormentor, lurking just outside, waiting patiently for the moment I would falter, waiting to drag me into the void. "I will not succumb," I whispered to the darkness, my voice trembling yet resolute, as if the very act of declaring my defiance might ward off the encroaching horror. The door trembled against my back, a soft, insistent tapping reverberating through the wood. It felt alive, vibrating with the dread that threatened to consume me. I dared not respond, fearing that any acknowledgement would draw the attention of whatever malevolent force lay in wait. It was then that I became acutely aware of the growing chill in the air, a frigid breeze that slithered through the cracks, coiling around me like a serpent preparing to strike. With every heartbeat, I felt the room constrict, the walls drawing closer, as if they too were complicit in this nightmarish play. It was not just the dread of the unknown that tormented me. It was the realization that the shadows had an insatiable appetite for fear, feasting on my very essence, savoring the taste of my anguish. Suddenly, the light flickered once more, plunging the room into utter darkness. My heart raced, a cacophony of frantic beats against the silence. I fumbled for the doorknob, trembling hands barely managing to grasp it. Should I dare venture out into the black abyss? The thought of facing whatever malevolence awaited me was nearly paralyzing. Yet the whispers grew louder, more insistent, drawing me in like moths to a flame. Help me? It was no longer just a plea. It had transformed into a siren's call, luring me into the depths of despair. Summoning what little courage remained, I turned the knob and opened the door just a crack, peering into the uncertain void. The hallway stretched before me, cloaked in shadows that writhed and twisted, evoking an unshakable sense of dread. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped into the dim light, the world outside the sanctuary of the bathroom feeling alien, hostile. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a silence so profound that it throbbed in my ears, wrapping around me like a shroud. I moved forward cautiously, every nerve ending alive with the knowledge that I was being watched. I could feel it. The presence, the unseen eyes boring into me, dissecting my every move with malicious intent. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the living room, shattering the silence like glass. My heart leaped into my throat, terror rendering me momentarily paralyzed. The sound was followed by a low, guttural growl, a sound so primal it resonated deep within my core, awakening a primal instinct to flee. But there was nowhere to run. I was trapped in a house that had become a labyrinth of horror, a stage for a malevolent force that toyed with me like a cat with its prey. As I stood there, heart racing, breath shallow, I realized that I was no longer the architect of my fate. I had become the unwitting protagonist in a nightmarish tale, penned by the hand of darkness itself. What awaited me in the depths of that shadowy abyss? The answer loomed over me, a harbinger of terror, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to step closer. The air was thick with dread, and as I took my first tentative step toward the source of the chaos, I knew deep down that there was no escaping the nightmare I had unwittingly invited into my life. The world around me was ensconced in shadows, an oppressive shroud that thickened with every heartbeat. My heart raced like a caged animal, desperate to escape the invisible snare tightening around my throat. Each step I took toward the living room felt like an act of folly, a venture into the jaws of some ancient, ravenous beast lying in wait. The air was thick with an unspeakable dread, curling around my lungs like smoke, suffocating me from the inside out. As I crossed the threshold into that cursed expanse, the remnants of familiarity dissipated, replaced by an eerie distortion of reality. The room was bathed in an unsettling twilight, the flickering shadows casting grotesque forms that twisted and writhed upon the walls, mocking my fear. I could almost hear the echo of my sanity fracturing, each pulse of adrenaline pushing me further into the abyss of my own mind. I strained my ears against the haunting silence, heart pounding with a rhythm that harmonized with the pulsing dread. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a miasma that clawed at my senses, pulling me deeper into the murky waters of despair. My thoughts spiraled into a vortex of paranoia as the shadows danced around me, whispering secrets that tugged at the fringes of my sanity. And then, there it was again, the guttural growl, a sound so primal it ignited a firestorm of terror within me. It reverberated through the very marrow of my bones, sending icy tendrils creeping up my spine. I was not alone. I could feel its presence lurking just beyond the periphery of my vision, an intangible weight that pressed down upon me like the heavy shroud of inevitability. Who's there? My voice trembled, a fragile whisper barely escaping my lips, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Silence enveloped me once more, a heavy cloak that stifled the air and sent a chill cascading down my spine. Was it a figment of my imagination? A cruel trick played by the malevolence that had invaded my sanctuary? I was teetering on the precipice of hysteria, my mind a battleground for reason and the encroaching chaos that threatened to consume me. Driven by a compulsion I could neither understand nor resist, I stepped deeper into the room, my senses heightened, alert to the unseen menace. The furniture stood still, frozen in a tableau of despair, their forms warped by the encroaching gloom. Shadows stretched and clawed at the edges of my vision, beckoning me to step further into the maw of madness. As I ventured forth, a chilling thought slithered into my mind. What if this nightmare was a reflection of my own psyche? What if the true horror lay not in the lurking presence, but within the fractured corridors of my own mind. The very idea sent a wave of nausea roiling through me, churning my stomach with the weight of dread. I glanced toward the windows, where the last vestiges of daylight clung desperately to the horizon, casting long, sinuous shadows that crept across the floor like dark tendrils of a waking nightmare. In that moment, I was acutely aware of how precariously I clung to my grip on reality, teetering on the edge of a dark abyss that beckoned me to plunge into its depths. Then, the growl erupted again, closer this time, a feral sound that resonated with the primal part of my being. It was a promise of violence, a harbinger of despair that sank its claws into my very essence. I could no longer deny it. Whatever had invaded my sanctuary was not merely a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was hungry. "Leave me be," I cried, the desperation pouring from my lips like a torrent, the rawness of my voice mingling with the shadows that seemed to swirl around me, coalescing into something grotesque, something that watched with a hunger I could almost taste. I stumbled back, my heart pounding a frantic symphony of fear, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But escape was a luxury I no longer possessed. The walls of my sanctuary closed in around me, solidifying into a prison of despair. I was trapped in a haunting cycle of dread, unable to sever the invisible ties that bound me to this sinister fate. My very soul felt forfeit, a bargaining chip in a game orchestrated by forces beyond my comprehension. As I searched the room for some semblance of clarity, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A shadow darted across the floor, a fleeting glimpse of something that sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I spun around, eyes wide with terror, every nerve ending alight with anticipation. The air crackled with electricity, an unspeakable tension that constricted around my throat, rendering me breathless. It was then that I realized the darkness was alive, a sentient entity that fed off my fear, thriving in the chaos of my spiraling thoughts. It pulsed with malevolence, reveling in my torment as I teetered on the brink of sanity. The room closed in around me, and I felt my grip on reality slipping, the edges of my consciousness fraying like the tattered fabric of a once familiar existence. Driven by a compulsion I could neither understand nor resist, I stepped deeper into the room, my senses heightened, alert to the unseen menace. The furniture stood still, frozen in a tableau of despair, their forms warped by the encroaching gloom. Shadows stretched and clawed at the edges of my vision, beckoning me to step further into the maw of madness. As I ventured forth, a chilling thought slithered into my mind. What if this nightmare was a reflection of my own psyche? What if the true horror lay not in the lurking presence, but within the fractured corridors of my own mind? The very idea sent a wave of nausea roiling through me, churning my stomach with the weight of dread. I glanced toward the windows, where the last vestiges of daylight clung desperately to the horizon, casting long, sinuous shadows that crept across the floor like dark tendrils of a waking nightmare. In that moment, I was acutely aware of how precariously I clung to my grip on reality, teetering on the edge of a dark abyss that beckoned me to plunge into its depths. Then the growl erupted again, closer this time, a feral sound that resonated with the primal part of my being. It was a promise of violence, a harbinger of despair that sank its claws into my very essence. I could no longer deny it. Whatever had invaded my sanctuary was not merely a figment of my imagination. It was real, and it was hungry. "Leave me be," I cried, the desperation pouring from my lips like a torrent, the rawness of my voice mingling with the shadows that seemed to swirl around me, coalescing into something grotesque, something that watched with a hunger I could almost taste. I stumbled back, my heart pounding a frantic symphony of fear, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But escape was a luxury I no longer possessed. The walls of my sanctuary closed in around me, solidifying into a prison of despair. I was trapped in a haunting cycle of dread, unable to sever the invisible ties that bound me to this sinister fate. My very soul felt forfeit, a bargaining chip in a game orchestrated by forces beyond my comprehension. As I searched the room for some semblance of clarity, a flicker of movement caught my eye. a shadow darted across the floor. A fleeting glimpse of something that sent a jolt of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I spun around, eyes wide with terror, every nerve ending alight with anticipation. The air crackled with electricity, an unspeakable tension that constricted around my throat, rendering me breathless. It was then that I realized. The darkness was alive, a sentient entity that fed off my fear, thriving in the chaos of my spiraling thoughts. It pulsed with malevolence, reveling in my torment as I teetered on the brink of sanity. The room closed in around me, and I felt my grip on reality slipping, the edges of my consciousness fraying like the tattered fabric of a once familiar existence. And yet, amid the encroaching darkness, I clung desperately to a sliver of hope, a flickering candle of defiance against the overwhelming tide of despair. But even as I fought against the encroaching shadows, a chilling realization settled in the pit of my stomach. Hope, like sanity, was a fragile construct, and I was standing on the edge of oblivion, teetering ever closer to the abyss. What awaited me there, I could only imagine, an eternity of torment, a descent into madness that would consume me whole. The weight of my dread intensified, and as the shadows writhed and clawed at the edges of my vision, I knew that I had to confront the malevolence that threatened to drag me into its insatiable maw. But deep down, a whisper of doubt lingered. What if the true horror lay not in the darkness outside, but in the shadows that lurked within my own soul? The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, a palpable tension that crackled like static electricity in the stillness of the room. I felt it clawing at my throat, a serpent of dread constricting around my very essence, and I stood paralyzed, grappling with the reality that had descended upon me like a funeral shroud. Shadows flickered across the walls, mocking my desperation, swirling in a grotesque dance that twisted my thoughts into a cacophony of horror. It was as though the darkness itself had come alive, breathing, pulsing, and eagerly awaiting my surrender. "Why have you come?" I croaked, my voice a mere whisper lost amid the encroaching darkness. The question hung in the air, a desperate plea for understanding amidst the chaos that reigned in my mind. I could almost hear the echoes of my own fear reverberating through the room, merging with the sinister whispers that slithered through the shadows, a twisted symphony composed of despair and madness. As I stood there, heart racing and breath quickening, I felt the presence coalesce, forming into something grotesque just beyond the edge of perception. My mind reeled with the realization that I was confronting a nightmare born not from the outside, but from the depths of my own psyche, a manifestation of my fears, regrets, and unspoken horrors. The shadows were not merely a backdrop to my terror. They were the very embodiment of my inner demons, relentless in their pursuit to consume me. With trembling hands, I reached for the only source of light left, my dim flashlight, its beam wavering like my own sanity. I flicked it on, and the beam cut through the suffocating darkness, illuminating the corners of the room with a ghostly glow. But the light, rather than banishing the shadows, only seemed to make them more pronounced, more sinister, as if they were aware of my feeble attempt to escape their grasp. In that moment I saw them, dark figures lurking in the periphery of my vision, grotesque and twisted, their features obscured by the shadowy veil that enveloped them. They whispered my name in hissing tones, a chorus of malevolence that seeped into my bones, chilling me to the core. Each syllable was a reminder of my failures, my isolation, a haunting refrain that played over and over, deepening the pit of despair in my stomach. "No more," I shouted, my voice a raw and desperate scream against the cacophony of dread that surrounded me. "I will not be your prey." The words felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread of defiance in the face of encroaching darkness. But even as I shouted, I felt the weight of their presence bearing down upon me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, drowning out my resolve. With renewed determination, I charged forward, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the oppressive gloom, illuminating the corners of my sanctuary as I sought the source of my torment. I had to confront it. I had to face the shadows that had haunted my every step, or risk being consumed by them entirely. As I moved deeper into the room, I felt a sudden chill race down my spine, a premonition that something was about to happen. The air shifted, heavy with an unspoken threat, and I turned to find the shadows coalescing into a singular form. A grotesque silhouette that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was an entity woven from the fabric of my nightmares, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger that sent icy tendrils of fear coursing through my veins. "Do you not see?" it hissed, its voice a whispering wind that seemed to curl around me, seeping into my thoughts, feeding on my fear. "You are the architect of your own demise. I am your reflection, the darkness you refuse to acknowledge." My heart thundered in my chest, a frantic drumbeat of terror as I realized the truth of its words. I had spent so long running from my demons, hiding in the shadows, that I had become ensnared in their web. The entity was a grotesque mirror, reflecting the horrors I had buried deep within my soul, and now it demanded my surrender. "Face me," it beckoned, its voice echoing in the hollow caverns of my mind. "Embrace the darkness, for it is a part of you. Only then will you find peace." As the shadows writhed around me, I felt an unsettling calm wash over me, as if I were being pulled into the very heart of darkness itself. It was terrifying, yet strangely liberating. A revelation that stripped away the facade I had clung to for so long. I closed my eyes, allowing the weight of my fear to wash over me like a tide, surrendering to the chaos that had once terrified me. In that moment of acceptance, the shadows shifted, transforming from menacing specters into a swirling dance of emotions, grief, anger, sorrow, and regret intertwining in a tragic ballet. I felt each whispering shadow become a part of me, merging with my essence, weaving a tapestry of my existence that was both terrifying and beautiful. When I opened my eyes again, the room was transformed. The darkness was no longer an adversary. It was a companion, an intrinsic part of my being that I could no longer deny. I stood amidst the shadows, no longer cowering, but embracing the complexity of my own humanity. As I took a step back, I felt an unexpected warmth enveloping me, a flicker of hope igniting within the abyss. I had faced my demons and emerged transformed. The shadows whispered no more. They faded into the background, allowing me to reclaim my identity. The horror that had haunted my existence had become a reflection of my strength, my ability to confront the darkest corners of my soul. And in that realization, I found a semblance of peace. The struggle was far from over. The shadows would always linger, a reminder of my own fragility. But now, they were no longer a source of fear. They were a part of my story, a testament to my resilience, reminding me that even in the depths of despair, there exists the possibility of redemption. As I stepped out of the darkness and into the fading light of the evening, I understood the truth. The real horror lay not in the shadows, but in the refusal to confront the darkness within. And so, I embraced my journey, a path marked by fear and uncertainty, but also one that held the promise of hope and the power to illuminate even the darkest corners of my soul. Thank you for watching. This video, like all the others on the channel, is made especially for you who love chilling content. I put a lot of care into creating each one. Please support the channel by subscribing so you won't miss any notifications and can help it grow. Be sure to watch the video on your screen now so we can stay connected. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. See you in the next one.